Today's episode, I am going to begin with a short story, but I ask that you stay with me, even though you may have fatigue over the COVID discussion, because I'm going to tie it to a more relevant topic. I am using the COVID example as a vehicle. So please stay with me if you would, at least through the introduction, to see if this is an episode that makes sense for you. Picture an ordinary person in the spring of 2021, not a crank, not an activist, say a nurse or an engineer or school teacher, just someone with a reasonable habit of asking questions. And a question occurs to this person, an ordinary one. Perhaps it is, how long should the schools really stay closed? And are we weighing the harm to children in the interim? Perhaps it is, if I've already had the illness and recovered, should my immunity count for something? And then perhaps maybe it's only, where did this virus come from and why am I not allowed to ask about a laboratory in its close proximity? And none of these are crazy questions. Each of them, we now know, was a question that serious and credentialed people were asking at the very same moment. But our ordinary person does not ask it out loud, or if they ask it once, they watch what happens. They watch that the word that gets attached to the question is conspiracy, denier, fringe, anti-science. They watch a friend get that word attached to them and go quiet. And so our ordinary person swallows the question. Not because a policeman came to the door, no one was arrested, no law was passed. They swallowed it because the room laughed or mocked. And the fear of being thought of a fool did the work that no censor had to do. And here's what I want you to notice about the moment and why it's relevant today. The thing that this person swallowed was not a lie. It was a reasonable question asked by a reasonable mind that later turned out to deserve an answer. And the mechanism that made them swallow that question was not jail. It was a feeling. The delegitimizing of their own reason. The quiet suggestion that a decent, intelligent person simply does not think that. That reached into one place a free society is supposed to leave untouched. And it shut the reasoning down before it ever reached speech. 5 centuries ago, a man was ordered to swallow his conscience by the 2 highest powers in his world, and he refused. And we built much of our civilization on that refusal. This episode is about what that refusal costs and what it protects. In an age when the pressure to swallow your own reason does not come from an emperor in a crowded hall. It comes from the machine in your hand and the room on the other side of it. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 5, part B of the series Self-Evident, The Road to 1776. It is our contemporary application episode connecting the historical principles we explored this past weekend to the liberty questions of our own moment. On Saturday, in episode 5, we stood at Worms in 1521 and watched a single monk refuse to recant his own conscience. And we traced the principle that broke loose from him, that a conscience answerable to a higher law may stand in judgment over any earthly institution and may, on that ground, refuse its obedience. We also watched that machine that carried that principle across the continent, the printing press. The printing press shattered the church's monopoly on what counted as truth because an idea once set in type could be reproduced faster than any authority could gather it up and burn it. Luther was the first man to prove on a continental scale what a free press could do to a power that claimed the sole right to define the truth. Today, we take both halves of that inheritance, the sovereignty of conscience and the free movement of ideas, and we hold them against the machine that Luther seized, which has become something he could have never have imagined. And before I go a step further, a word about what this episode is and is not, in the same spirit on the disclaimer we carried Saturday. Two of the cases I'm going to discuss tonight, the response to the COVID pandemic and the war with Iran, are live and they are bitterly contested. So let me be plain. This episode takes no side on the particulars of either one. It does not tell you which pandemic policy was wise or what the strikes on Iran did or did not accomplish. Reasonable people still argue over those particulars, and they will argue over them for years, and that argument is not a problem to be solved. It is exactly what a free people's power of reason is for. The target of this episode is never which answer turned out to be right. The target is the suppression of asking, the throttling of the transmission that a free conscience needs in order to reason at all. So thank you for bearing with me through that introduction. And if you're still with me, let us begin.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast. Here we ask a simple question of the history and the actions that have shaped our lives.
Did this leave us more free or more governed? Because what we do not know can be used to govern us.
And what we choose to ignore always will.
Let us start with what the printing press actually did, because we tend to remember it as a technical convenience. Books got cheaper, and we miss the political earthquake underneath. Before the press, the reproduction of any text meant a scribe copying it by hand, slowly, and at great cost, which meant that ideas themselves were scarce and controlled and easy to suppress by whomever controlled the scribes. Whoever controlled transmission controlled truth. And the medieval church understood this perfectly. Its entire project in the domain of belief was the control of transmission, to stand as the single authorized channel between the individual and the sacred text. To keep the scriptures in Latin, the plowman could not read, and to treat certain ideas as too dangerous to be let loose. Wycliffe was condemned for putting the Bible into English. Huss was burned. The danger was real from the institution's point of view, because an idea it could not control was an idea that could judge it. The press broke that control, and it broke it in a specific way that matters for everything that follows. It did not merely spread more ideas, it handed the individual the primary sources and let him reason for himself. This is why Luther labored to translate the Bible into German, because the priesthood of all believers, the doctrine that every person stands in a direct relationship with God, needed no official interpreter. It requires a people who can encounter the text directly without a licensed channel standing in between. The press, plus the vernacular Bible, produced for the first time on a mass scale a reader who could check the institution's claim against the evidence himself, and an individual that could reach their own verdict. Now hold that next to the sovereignty of conscience, because the two are halves of one machine. Luther's conscience was binding as he understood it, not because it was merely his own preference, but because it had been captured by scripture and evident reason, because he had read the sources and could not honestly deny what they showed. Take away his access to the sources, and his conscience has nothing to be captive to. That is the point the whole episode turns on, so let me state it flatly. Conscience, the thing Luther set free, is not a feeling in a vacuum. It is a faculty of judgment, and like any faculty of judgment, it requires two things to function: true premise to reason from, and the freedom to reach a conclusion without being punished for it. The free transmission of truth supplies the first, and the liberty of conscience protects the second. Attack either one, and you have not merely inconvenienced a citizen, you have disabled the sovereign reason that a free people is supposed to govern itself by. Which gives us the exact test to carry through the rest of this hour. Every throttle and transmission, every institution that decides some ideas are too dangerous to be let loose is doing again what the church did to Wycliffe and Huss, deciding on the citizen's behalf what he is permitted to reason about. Sometimes the danger is even real. That is precisely what makes the question hard, and precisely what a free people has already answered at a price paid in blood across the century after Worms. Let us look at where the throttle operates right now. As some of you listening to the episode this past weekend, you may have thought that the contemporary application would actually come here, that we would talk about the suppression of ideas during the pandemic. So if you did, you were right. Let us go there. The pandemic gave us the clearest modern case of controlled transmission since the age of the licensed printer, and it came in two forms: one loud and one quiet. The quiet one is the more important, and it is the one we open with. So let's take the loud one out first and clear it out of the way. The loud form is the overt oppression of the state of private channels of speech. Beginning in 2020, agencies of the federal government, the White House, the Surgeon General's office, the Center for Disease Control, the FBI, and others communicated regularly with the social media platforms about what they regarded as pandemic misinformation and election misinformation. At times, publicly calling on the platforms to do more, at times flagging specific content. A set of internal platform documents released in 2022 and 2023, which came to be known as the Twitter files, was reported by the journalist who reviewed them to show federal agencies routinely flagged posts for suppression, including, those journalists said, true posts about vaccine side effects, about natural immunity, and about the harm of lockdowns. This is contested ground. Other analysts argued that a platform choosing to act on a government flag is not the same thing as state censorship, since the platform itself is a private company making its own moderation decisions. Yeah, that dispute is real. I'm not going to wave it away, but the legal record tells you which way the wind was blowing. A lawsuit over exactly this conduct, Missouri versus Biden, later styled as Murphy versus Missouri, ran to the Supreme Court. And here I'm going to be very precise, because the case is easy to overstate. The court did not rule that the government censored anyone. In 2024, by 6-3, it threw the case out on standing. It held that the particular plaintiffs could not show a concrete enough link between a specific government action and a specific restriction on their own speech. The majority never reached the underlying question of whether the pressure violated the First Amendment. But the dissent, written by Justice Alito and joined by two others, looked at the same record and saw a coterie of officials at the highest level of government continuing to pressure platforms. In Alito's words, no less coercive for being more subtle than a naked command. And here's the part that actually settles the matter quietly years later in March of 2026. The government entered into a legal settlement that bars the Surgeon General, the CDC, and the Cybersecurity Agency from coercing or threatening the platforms over content moderation for the next 10 years. You do not agree to stop doing a thing for a decade if you were never doing it. The overt throttle was real. Now the quiet form. And this is the one that matters most, and the one Luther would recognize as the deeper wound. The overt censorship reached only as far as the government's arm. The quiet censorship needs no arm at all because it works on the inside of a citizen. It is the branding of a reasonable question as the mark of a fool or a fanatic. And it's the self-silencing that branding produces that make it so harmful. Recall the questions from the top of this hour: whether the virus might have come from a laboratory, whether natural immunity from prior infection was real and protective, whether the prolonged closure of schools was doing more harm to the children than the disease was doing to them. Each of these was, in 2020 and 2021, widely treated in respectable channels as conspiracy theory, the stuff of cranks. And each of them was, at the very same moment, a live and legitimate question among serious scientists. And each has been substantially vindicated on at least the reasonable portion of that deserving an airing. I am not telling you that the vindicated position was necessarily the correct one, at least not in this episode. If you want more of that, you can follow me on X and we can have other discussions. But that is not my point today. because it would be the wrong point. Some of what was suppressed was false, and some of what was suppressed was true. That is what an open contest of ideas is for, to sort them. My point is about the mechanism. When a society brands the reasonable question itself as disreputable, when it attaches the word conspiracy not to a demonstrated falsehood, but to an act of asking, it produces a soft censorship that reaches where no government can reach. It reaches into the citizen who is afraid of being thought of as a kook. It makes him censor himself out of embarrassment before he ever opens his mouth. Then a citizen who has been trained to distrust his own reason, to preemptively swallow the question that might get him laughed at, is a citizen whose conscience has been disabled from the inside. That is a subtler tyranny than the church ever managed, because the church had to burn you. This one persuades you to burn your own question and to thank the room for the warning. This is where the whole liberty versus security argument actually lives. And Saturday's episode already gave us the framing for it. The case for controlling dangerous ideas is the Erasmus case. The fear that a rupture once loosed brings catastrophe, and that some things are better kept from spiraling and spreading for the sake of peace and safety. And the century of religious war that followed Worms vindicated that fear in blood. Erasmus was not wrong about that the danger was real, but the ideas still had to be set free. And a free people concluded from that very carnage that a system which suppresses the dangerous but true, along with the dangerous and false, which brands the reasonable question as heresy, is the church's system. And that of the two errors, it is the worst one. The whole achievement of the principle that broke loose at Worms was the discovery that you cannot get the safety by coercing the conscience, because the coercion produces only corpses and hypocrites. And we can now add a population trained not to think. Now we raise the stakes to the highest level there is and watch the same throttle operate, not on a domestic health debate, but on the question of war and peace, where the corruption of transmissions gets thousands of people killed. I've spoken before on this program across the Empire of Liberty series about the long pattern by which a nation is talked into war on a premise that later collapses. The Maine, the Gulf of Tonkin, the weapons of mass destruction. I'm not going to retrace that lineage tonight because there is a sharper and more immediate point available. And it is the Luther point rather than a foreign policy one. It is this: a war narrative is an attack on the premise of conscience itself. A free people is supposed to be the final judge of whether its sons are sent to kill and die. But a people can only render that judgment on the facts it is given. Corrupt the transmission of the facts at the source, and you have not merely told a lie, you have disabled the sovereign conscience of a nation before it ever gets to reason. The lie is not the deepest injury. The deepest injury is that the people's power of judgment has been cut off. And we've watched this happen in real time. This very year over the war with Iran, not as deception uncovered decades later, but as a certainty manufactured in front of us over the stated objection of the government's own analysts. When American forces struck Iranian nuclear sites, the administration declared within hours, before any formal intelligence assessment existed, that the strikes had obliterated Iran's nuclear program. Then, a preliminary assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency was leaked. A low-confidence assessment by its own labeling, and it said something markedly different. That the most fortified sites remained structurally intact, that Iran had moved its enriched uranium before the strikes, and that the program had been set back by a matter of months rather than destroyed. Senior officials then went before the public and asserted severe damage that would take years to rebuild, implicitly contradicting their own agency's finding. And a major newspaper reported intercepted communications suggesting the damage was less devastating than the public had been told. Set aside, as our disclaimer requires, the question of which assessment was correct. I do not know. And today, it does not matter. What matters is the shape of the thing. And an intelligence scholar writing at the time named that shape precisely. The closer intelligence assessments are pulled into the construction of a narrative, the harder it becomes to sustain their independence, because analysts exist to bound uncertainty, not to validate the certainty that policymakers already believe they possess. That is the mechanism, stated in the profession's own language. Certainty was manufactured for public consumption, ahead of the evidence and against the caution of analysts whose job it is to be honest about what is not yet known. And a public-handed manufactured certainty is a public whose conscience has been fed false premises. A public that cannot reason its way to a sovereign judgment about its own war, because the raw material of judgment has been adulterated before it arrives. Recall that in the run-up to these events, polling found that only 1 in 5 Americans supported striking Iran, and roughly half considered it unnecessary. That is a people whose reason, left to work on the honest facts, was reaching one conclusion, while the machinery of official narrative worked to manufacture another. This is the transmission attack in its gravest form. The church wanted to control what you could read about your soul. The war narrative controls what you can know about whether your country is about to kill in your name. Same throttle, and the same casualty, the sovereign conscience of a free people disabled at the source. So far, this has been a chronicle of throttles, and I do not want to leave you there, because the other half of the Luther inheritance is the hopeful half, and it is alive right now. When the institutional channels of transmission are throttled, when the licensed press decides which questions are respectable, and when the official narrative crowds out the analyst's caution, the ideas do not simply die. They route around. And they route around through exactly the mechanism Luther pioneered. A new press, cheaper and faster than the authorities can control, that lets a writer reach the public directly, over the heads of the institution that would prefer he be quiet. In Luther's day, it was the German pamphlet, printed faster than the church could gather it up. In ours, it is the podcast and the newsletter and the independent platform, the whole flowering of what is called new media, in which a person with a microphone or a Substack can carry an argument to hundreds of thousands of listeners and readers without asking a single gatekeeper's permission. This program is one very small instance of that flowering, and so are a great many others across every point of the spectrum. The plowman has a press again. The priesthood of all believers has become, in the realm of public argument, something close to a press for all citizens. That is the genuine good news, and it is not small. The same technology that can be turned into a throttle is also the greatest engine for routing around throttles that has existed since Gutenberg. A reasonable question that gets branded as kookery in the licensed channels can find, in the independent ones, a fair hearing and an honest airing, which is exactly what a free conscience needs. But there's a warning in the same breath as the good news, and here it is, because the news is genuinely double-edged, and I'm not going to sell you the sunny half alone. The new presses are not the open commons they can appear to be. They are privately owned choke points. The podcast reaches you through a handful of distribution platforms. The newsletter reaches you through a handful of hosts. The video reaches you through 1 or 2 dominant services, and all of them controlled by some form of algorithm. Every one of those choke points can throttle, can demote, can suspend, can remove. And as the pandemic showed, they can be leaned on by the state to do so. The routing around works only so long as the platforms allow it to. The new pamphleteer publishes at the sufferance of a private power that now sits structurally very near the place the church licensors once occupied. The power to decide what may be transmitted and what may not. And that's the deep irony of the whole inheritance, the one Luther himself never resolved and could not have foreseen. The machine that broke the church's monopoly on truth did not abolish monopoly. In the long run, it built new ones. The press that liberated the individual conscience from a gatekeeper became 5 centuries on a new set of gatekeepers with a reach the church could only have dreamed of. Luther loosed a principle he could not control, and he loosed a machine he could not control either. And we, today, live inside both the liberation and the danger of it. The free movement of ideas is more possible than it has ever been, and more revocable than it has ever been at the very same time. Both things are true. And a free people has to hold both of them, because the moment it forgets the second, it loses the first. And now a recurring segment that we've been doing in these episodes. I want to present the strongest case against everything I just argued. I want to state it at full strength before I answer any word of it. So there are 3 serious objections, and each deserve a fair hearing. The first one is Erasmus's own turn forward into our moment. Unfiltered transmission, the critic says, has a body count. The very article this series published conceded that the printing press did not only spread liberty, it spread the pamphlet wars and the confessional hatreds that helped plunge Europe into a century of religious slaughter. An information environment with no gatekeepers at all does not produce a nation of sober reasoners. It produces mobs, panics, foreign disinformation, medical quackery that kills, and an incitement that ends in blood. Erasmus foresaw exactly this and counseled against the rupture. And on the body count, he was right. Perhaps some gatekeeping is simply the price of a civilization that does not tear itself apart. The second objection grants my own framework and presses it at its weakest point. Take the pandemic argument and hypothesize it forward to a genuinely lethal outbreak. A disease far deadlier than COVID, spreading fast, in which a viral falsehood about a fake cure or a refused vaccine will demonstrably get large numbers of people killed within weeks. In that case, the critic asked, does the state have an affirmative duty to suppress the lethal falsehood? A duty that outweighs the abstract liberty of conscience to encounter every dangerous idea? If a lie will fill the morgues, is silence simply not the government's doing its most basic job, which is to keep people alive? And the third objection is the weightiest, and it strikes at the war argument. Some things, the critic says, are confidential for good reasons, and the reason is not always a cover-up. Sources and methods get people killed when they are exposed. An intelligence officer's caution about revealing an assessment may be protecting a human agent whose life depends on secrecy, not protecting a politician from embarrassment. Total transparency in matters of national security is not a virtue. It is a recklessness that ends with informants in unmarked graves. The demand that the state transmit everything to the people at once treats every secret as a lie, and that, the critic concludes, is a childish view of a dangerous world. Okay, let me answer them in order, and let me give the third the most room because it deserves it. To Erasmus, turn forward. The concession is granted entirely. Unfiltered transmission does have a body count, and a free press does spread poison along with medicine. But the reply is the one the century after Worms actually taught. Purchased at a price no one would choose to pay again. The cure of coercing conscience is worse than the disease of free transmission. Because the coercion does not eliminate the dangerous ideas, it only drives them underground while also crushing the true ones. And it hands to some authority the power to decide which is which. The exact power that produced the stake and the burning. Religious liberty was not handed down clean at Worms. It was an exhausted conclusion drawn from that carnage. That a society which tries to compel belief by force produces only, as I've said many times, corpses and hypocrites. And that the only durable piece is the one that leaves conscience alone. We're not choosing between a safe, filtered world and a dangerous, free one. We're choosing between two dangers. And a free people long ago learned which danger it could survive and which it could not. to the lethal outbreak hypothetical. I will not pretend it is easy, and I will grant that a demonstrable, imminent, lethal falsehood, the shout of fire that empties the theater into a stampede, is the one place the line genuinely bends. But notice what the objection quietly assumes, that the state can be trusted to identify the lethal falsehood correctly, in real time, and under pressure. And the whole of my previous statements is evidence that it cannot. Because the last time we ran this experiment, the things branded as lethal falsehoods included the laboratory question and the natural immunity question and the school closure question. Reasonable positions later substantially vindicated. The cure the objection proposes corrupts the very faculty a free people needs to survive a real emergency. A population trained to distrust its own reason, conditioned to swallow whatever question the authorities have branded disreputable, is not safer in the next pandemic. It is more vulnerable, because when the authorities are wrong, and they will sometimes be wrong, there is no longer a citizenry capable of noticing. The reasoning public is not a luxury you suspend in an emergency. It is the last line of defense when experts err. And the third objection, the serious one about secrecy. I concede the principle without reservation. Some secrets are legitimate. Sources and methods are real. Agents' lives are real. Not every classification stamp hides a crime. A grown-up view of the world grants that a state conducting genuine defense has things it cannot say out loud. So the argument cannot be that secrecy is never justified. The argument has to be measured. And is this: weigh the principle against the record. Look at what has actually been found again and again when the confidential material was finally unsealed. The Pentagon Papers did not reveal sources and methods that got agents killed. They revealed that the government had known the war was unwinnable while telling the public it was being won. The declassified truth about the Gulf of Tonkin did not protect an informant. It protected a fiction that launched a war. The record of weapons of mass destruction did not shield a human source. It shielded the manufacturer of a certainty that did not exist. Over and over, when the seal finally breaks, what the secrecy turns out to have been protecting is not the source, but the failure. Not the agent in the field, but the official who was wrong or lying or did not want to be caught. That is not proof that every secret is a cover-up. It is a documented pattern strong enough to shift the burden. The presumption cannot be that the people must justify their right to know. The presumption must be that the state must justify each thing it hides, because its track record, once the record opens, is the track record of an institution that has used the word confidential to mean embarrassing far more often than it has been used to mean deadly. Sunlight has a body count too, the critic says. Perhaps. But the unsealed record shows that darkness has buried far more. So let us once more apply the liberty test, our recurring tool across this series, to the coercion of conscience and the throttling of ideas. The liberty test asks two questions. Could a private individual rightfully do the thing in question? And if not, can a group of individuals, a government, rightfully delegate to itself a power that none of them held alone? The principle beneath both is the one this whole series has carried from Bastiat and the natural law of tradition. A government's just powers are only the powers its members already possessed and handed up. And a people cannot delegate an authority that no one of them ever owned. Let's run the coercion and conscience through it. Could you, a private individual, rightfully force your neighbor, on pain of ruin, of losing his job, a public disgrace, to profess a belief he does not hold, or to stay silent about a question he sincerely wishes to ask? You could not. To force a man to say what he does not believe, or to forbid him from asking what he genuinely wonders, is a power no private person holds over another. It is the precise power of the medieval church claimed, and the confessional state claimed, the power to compel the conscience. And the whole principle that broke loose at Worms was the discovery that it is a power that no one may rightfully wield. And so, by the logic of the test, it is not a power that a group could have delegated to the government because no one of them ever had it to give. When the state compels profession or punishes a question, it is exercising a delegated authority. It is claiming the church's old crown. Now, here's the wrinkle this episode adds, the one the soft-censorship cases forces us to confront. Most of the throttling I have described today did not take the form of the overt state force. It took the form of a manufactured environment of ridicule, an official nudge to the private gatekeepers, a certainty broadcast to crowd out a doubt. And you might think the liberty test has nothing to say about that because no one was jailed. But look again. When an arm of a government orchestrates the conditions under which a citizen silences himself, when it leans on the platforms, when it brands the questions and manufactures the certainty so that a citizen swallows his own reason without a single arrest, it is exercising the same forbidden power by quieter means. The church did not always burn people either. Most of the time, it simply made the cost of honest questions high enough that the question went unasked. The coercion of conscience does not require a fire. It requires that the reasonable person learn to be afraid of his own mind. And a free people guards against the quiet version most of all, because the quiet version is the one that leaves the form of liberty intact while hollowing out the substance. Exactly the Roman lessons this series taught us in the early episodes, but now applied to the conscience. That is the inheritance that Worms made present. The machine sets the conscience free by carrying the truth past the gatekeepers. The task of a free people in an age of new and greater gatekeepers is to keep that channel open, to defend both halves of what Luther loosed, the free movement of facts a conscience must reason from, and the liberty of conscience to reason without penalty. Guard those two things, and you have guarded the sovereign reason a free people governs itself by. Lose either one, and the fancy hats and the larger mobs will do the rest. So this is the conscience and the machine, then and now. In 1521, it was a monk with a translated Bible and a printer, proving that authority claiming the sole right to define truth could be routed around by a man who could read the sources for himself. In our own century, it is the same fight. On a machine grown vast beyond Luther's imagining, a machine that can carry reasonable questions to far hearing and can also be throttled, branded, and switched off, sometimes by the state directly and sometimes by the private powers it leans on. The thing Luther set free was not merely the right to speak, it was the sovereign reason of the individual, the faculty that requires true premises to work on and the freedom to reach its own verdict. Everything I've described tonight is an attack on one of those two requirements. The branded question attacks the freedom to reason. The manufactured war narrative attacks the premise. The throttle platform attacks both at once. And the defense is not to smash the machine any more than the answer to a corrupt press would have been to smash the printing press. The defense is to insist, as stubbornly as a monk in a hall full of emperors, that the channels stay open, that the reasonable question keep its right to be asked, and that no authority, public or private, be permitted to decide on our behalf which ideas we are grown up enough to reason about. We continue to post articles and reason these things through in the open, which is the whole point. A small press routing around the gatekeepers for as long as the machine allows it and fighting to keep it allowed. Next Saturday, in episode 6, this series takes up the question Luther refused to answer. When may a people lawfully say no to a king? We turn to the Calvinist resistance theorists who took the loose principles of conscience and forged it into a rigorous doctrine of lawful resistance to tyrants. The doctrine that runs in a direct line toward a declaration. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 5, part B, of Self-Evident, The Road to 1776 on the Consequential Actions podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com, where you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause, the New Leviathan, and the Empire of Liberty. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast. There you'll get video versions of all podcast episodes. And follow me on X at @JKellick for updates, discussion, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until then, have a great day.